The forest air was cold, carrying with it a feeling of restlessness that seemed to weigh heavily on Emma's shoulders. Every step the wheelchair took over the uneven ground was accompanied by the rustling of leaves and the snapping of dry branches. Margaret, his stepmother, pushed the chair with a calm that seemed unnatural, almost as if she was savoring the growing tension in the air. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows between the trees, giving the landscape a dark, almost otherworldly appearance. Emma felt the biting wind on her face, but the cold that bothered her most came from inside. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Margaret didn't look at her, didn't exchange words, just pushed the chair with firm and calculated steps. A clearing appeared ahead, an open space in the heart of the forest, where the silence seemed even more suffocating. Margaret stopped, fixed her hair, and turned to Emma with a smile that seemed more like a disguise, a cold gesture masked by sweetness. "You're going to be right here. Someone is going to find you," Margaret said, her voice smooth as silk but filled with something sharp and cruel. Emma's eyes widened, her heart pounding in her chest. "Please, don't leave me here! Don't go!" Logically, he pleaded, his trembling voice almost swallowed by the forest. Margaret ignored it. He turned without looking back and began walking away, the sound of his footsteps resonating between the trees, each crack of dry twig marking the growing distance between them. "Margaret, please come back!" Zrenia, Emma kriknula, "No eogolos pokazalos propadat vi bezgranik nosti lesa." When the footsteps finally disappeared, silence fell over the clearing like a heavy blanket. Emma remained motionless, her hands gripping the chair supports tightly, fear dominating every fiber of her being. Why did she do this to me? What will happen now? Desperate thoughts raced through his mind as his eyes roamed the surrounding trees. The distant sound of rustling leaves and snapping branches made his heart race. Was it just the wind? Or something else? Darkness began to spread, enveloping everything around him. The cold became more intense, making Emma hug her own arms in an attempt to warm herself. He tried to push the wheels of the chair, but the uneven ground and the exhausted strength of his arms made the effort futile. She was trapped. Time seemed to drag by, and the feeling of abandonment began to transform into something even deeper, fear of the unknown. The forest felt alive, with every sound echoing as if something or someone was nearby. Emma felt the tears fall down her face, but she didn't have the strength to wipe them away. Everything about her screamed for help, but the fear that no one would come was as overwhelming as the darkness that surrounded her. Suddenly, something changed. An even deeper silence took over the clearing. There was no longer the sound of birds or the rustling of leaves. Only the ragged sound of his own breathing remained. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine, an instinctive feeling that she was no longer alone. The forest wasn't just a setting, she seemed to be watching. At that moment, the certainty of loneliness was mixed with the fear of what could be hidden in the shadows. The clearing, which had seemed so open, now felt like a prison. And Emma, alone and vulnerable, faced the cruel abandonment of her stepmother and the mysterious presence of the forest that seemed to want to swallow her. The silence in the clearing was so absolute that Emma could almost hear the rapid beat of her own heart. The cold of the night became more intense, making your fingers tremble as you gripped the chair supports. She kept her eyes fixed on the shadows of the trees, trying to make out shapes, while her mind alternated between fear and hopelessness. It was then that something caught his attention. Two golden lights appeared in the darkness, shining like candle flames. They were eyes, fixed on it, intense and still. The air seemed to become denser, difficult to breathe. Emma's heart raced and she swallowed hard, trying to understand what she was seeing. Maybe it was his imagination. Maybe it was just the reflection of the moon. But when her eyes slowly blinked, she knew she wasn't alone. The creature emerged from the shadows, each movement fluid and silent, as if the forest gave way to its presence. It was a wolf, large, with black fur that seemed to absorb the light around him, making him almost indistinguishable from the darkness. His eyes, however, continued to shine, fixed on Emma with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see through her to her soul. Panic rose like an overwhelming wave, but something stopped her. The wolf didn't growl. He didn't show his teeth, he just watched. For a moment it seemed as if time had stopped, leaving just the two of them in the clearing, connected by an invisible thread. "Please go away," Emma murmured, her voice coming out in a threat of despair. The wolf tilted his head slightly, as if considering his words, a gesture that seemed strangely human. Emma's fear began to mix with something else. Curiosity. Why didn't he attack? Why did he just stand there, staring at her? He took a step forward, slow and deliberate, and the sound of his paws touching the ground was almost imperceptible. Emma held her breath, feeling the weight of that movement. The wolf stopped a few meters from her, sitting down with an elegance that seemed to defy the savage. The glow in the animal's eyes seemed more intense under the pale light of the moon, and Emma, still shaking, was unable to look away. Something about her changed. Absolute dread began to give way to a strange sense of security. It was irrational, she knew, but there was something about that animal that wasn't purely wild. She reached out tentatively, but couldn't move more than a few inches. "Are you here for me?" he asked, not knowing why he had said that. The wolf didn't respond, of course, but his eyes seemed to shine even more brightly, as if he understood. He neither advanced nor retreated. He just stood there, motionless, with a calm that seemed to dominate the entire clearing. The silence around was as dense as the mystery that surrounded that moment. Emma knew that nothing made sense. A wolf should be dangerous, unpredictable, but that animal didn't look like a simple predator. He looked like something more, something she couldn't understand, but somehow made her feel less alone. As the cold of the night intensified, Emma realized that, for the first time since Margaret had abandoned her, she was not completely at the mercy of the darkness. And although she didn't know why, she felt that that wolf in some way was there for her. The night deepened, enveloping the clearing in a darkness that seemed almost palpable. The air was freezing, but Emma barely noticed the cold now. His attention was completely focused on the wolf in front of him, which remained motionless, like a statue carved in the darkness. He was no simple forest creature. There was something about him that made her feel a mixture of fascination and inexplicable relief. The wolf tilted his head again, watching her with his golden eyes that seemed to glow unearthly. His every movement was deliberate, almost careful, as if he knew that any sudden gesture could frighten her even more. Emma, still shaking, hugged her own arms, trying to warm herself. The animal, as if sensing his need, took a step forward, its slow, steady breathing warming the air around it. "Why are you here?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. The wolf didn't respond, of course, but his posture, his look, everything about him conveyed something that Emma couldn't explain. He seemed to be there for a reason, and somehow she began to believe that she was the reason. Slowly, the wolf lay down next to the wheelchair, just a few steps away. He settled down on the ground, his paws stretched out in front of him and his nose resting on them, but his eyes never left Emma. He was a silent but imposing presence, like a guardian who watches without ever relaxing. The fear that had gripped her since Margaret abandoned her began to subside, replaced by a strange sense of comfort. The clearing, once oppressive and threatening, now seemed less hostile. The wolf was there. He wouldn't leave her alone. Emma let out a shaky breath, feeling tears filling her eyes again. This time, however, it wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, a relief mixed with a sense of belonging that she couldn't explain. Why wouldn't he leave? Why did he stay there next to her when he could simply disappear into the forest? "Thank you," she whispered, almost not realizing she had said it out loud. The wolf raised his head slightly, ears moving towards him as if he understood. His bright eyes met hers, and in that moment, Emma felt something she had never imagined possible. Connection. Not with words, but with a silent understanding that seemed to flow between them. For hours, they stayed like that. The wolf remained beside her, listening to every sound in the forest. When the wind rustled the leaves or a branch snapped in the distance, he raised his head, ears alert, inspecting his surroundings like a true guardian. Emma watched every movement, every gesture, and little by little her body began to relax. There was something about the steady rhythm of the wolf's breathing, the way he kept his eyes fixed on her, that conveyed a security she had never felt before. Even in the presence of an animal that should be dangerous, she felt strangely protected. She began to speak, her voice breaking the silence of the clearing in hesitant murmurs. It wasn't so he understood exactly what he was saying, but because somehow it felt natural to talk to him. "I thought I would be alone here forever, but you came. I don't know why, but thank you." The wolf didn't respond, but his eyes shone with an intensity that seemed to say it all. He didn't need words. His presence, his silence, his constant vigil were the answer. And as the moon rose in the sky, illuminating the clearing with its pale light, Emma realized that she was no longer alone. The wolf had become more than a wild animal. He was her protector, her guardian. And as irrational as it was, she knew in her heart that he wouldn't leave her until she was safe. Night fell like a heavy veil over the farm, bringing with it a cold that seeped through the windows and made Helen adjust her shawl repeatedly, more out of anxiety than to keep warm. The kitchen was silent, but the silence was not comforting. On the contrary, it was oppressive, as if the entire house knew something was out of place. Emma's suitcase, abandoned near the door, seemed to emit a silent scream that something was wrong. "George," Helen called, her voice full of tension, as she tried to keep her hands busy washing the dishes. She knew that George would listen to her, even if he was in the room, immersed in his routine of reading the newspaper. The husband looked up from the paper, immediately recognizing the concern in his wife's voice. He folded the newspaper carefully and went into the kitchen. "What's wrong, Helen?" "Why are you so nervous?" he asked, trying to hide his own growing concern. "It's Emma's suitcase. Why is it still here? Margaret said she was going to take it for a walk, but it's already late, and they haven't come back." "That doesn't seem right," Helen replied, pointing to the object next to the door. George frowned, his expression changing from curiosity to alert. He knew something was wrong, even if he didn't want to admit it. Margaret had never been the type of person to trust, and although he had accepted her presence in Emma's life out of necessity, he had always been suspicious of her intentions. "I'm going after them," said George resolutely, already taking the flashlight that was in the cupboard next to the door. "George, what if they come back? What if you get lost in this forest at night? Zrenia, Kellen popitalas's dokazat, derja rukumuja. If they come back, call me. But I'm not staying here while my granddaughter could be in danger," he replied, his voice firm as a rock. Without waiting any longer, he put on his heavy coat, adjusted the flashlight in his hands, and walked out the door, disappearing into the cold night. The forest was a place that George knew well. He had grown up walking those trails, hunting and exploring every corner. But at night, everything seemed different. The tall trees seemed more menacing, their shadows dancing like specters in the dim flashlight light. The wind made the leaves rustle, creating a sound that seemed like distant murmurs. Each snap of a branch made George's heart accelerate, but he continued moving forward, guided by love and concern for Emma. As he followed the main trail, he shined his flashlight on the ground, looking for any sign that could indicate the path Margaret and Emma had taken. For a moment, he thought about how he had allowed his granddaughter to go with Margaret that afternoon. Guilt gnawed at him. "How could I be so careless?" he muttered to himself. It was then that something caught his attention. A piece of blue fabric hung from a low branch. George stopped abruptly, bending down to pick up the piece of cloth with trembling fingers. It was from Emma's dress, he was sure. The floral pattern was unmistakable. Holding the fabric, he felt a mixture of relief and dread. "I'm on the right path," he whispered, though the words barely brought comfort. He continued along the trail, now more attentive, looking for any other sign. It didn't take long for him to find something even more disturbing. Footprints on the ground, too big to be human. George bent down, illuminating the marks with the flashlight. They had the unmistakable shape of paws, but they were not those of an ordinary dog. They were much larger, deeper, and suggested the weight of an imposing animal. "Wolf ... Component placement," he said in a low voice, his blood running cold at the idea. Wolves were rare in that region, but not impossible, and the possibility of Emma being lost in the forest with such a dangerous creature nearby made George's determination grow. He couldn't stop now. The trail seemed to narrow as he approached the clearing. The silence around was oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. George felt sweat running down the back of his neck, despite the biting cold of the night. Each step seemed heavier, as if the ground itself wanted to hinder his journey. When he finally arrived at the clearing, the scene he encountered made his heart stop for a moment. In the center of the open space, Emma sat in her wheelchair, motionless. Beside her rested a black wolf, his immense figure illuminated only by the pale light of the moon. The animal's golden eyes shone like two torches fixed on Henry. "Emma!" he shouted, his voice full of relief and despair. The wolf stood up immediately, his posture tense but not aggressive. He looked directly at George, his eyes bright as if assessing the situation. George stopped in place, aware that any sudden movement could trigger an unpredictable reaction. "It's me, Grandpa," he said, trying to remain calm even though his heart was hammering in his chest. Emma, with tears streaming down her face, managed to murmur, "He stayed with me, Grandpa. He protected me." George looked at the animal again, trying to understand what was happening. The wolf didn't look like a predator looking for prey. There was something more to him, something George couldn't explain. Carefully, George took a step forward and knelt beside Emma. He hugged her tightly, feeling his granddaughter's trembling body against his. "I'm here now, my little one. You're safe," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. The wolf remained where he was, observing the scene with his intense eyes. George knew he should feel afraid, but all he felt was gratitude. Somehow that animal had protected his granddaughter. "Thank you," murmured George, not knowing if the wolf would understand. The animal tilted its head slightly, as if recognizing the gesture, before taking a few steps back, remaining close but respecting the distance. George got up, adjusting the flashlight and preparing to leave with Emma. But to their surprise, the wolf began walking alongside them, as if to ensure they reached safety. The forest seemed less threatening with that imposing figure at its side. George couldn't explain what had happened that night, but one thing was certain. He would never forget the moment when the forest and the wolf guided him to his granddaughter. The farm was finally within sight. The dim lights coming from the windows seemed like a sanctuary of warmth and security amidst the darkness of the forest. George pushed Emma's wheelchair as carefully as possible, the uneven terrain making each step difficult. Helen waited on the balcony, her eyes fixed on the horizon, and when she saw the figures approaching, she ran as if time were against her. "Emma, my girl!" "Zrenia, plakala Helen, golos itriasia oremotsi, kakona bezhala, shtobiobniat." George stopped next to his granddaughter, allowing his wife to wrap her arms around her. However, something caught Helen's attention. His eyes fell on the figure of the wolf, who was standing at the edge of the forest, his paws firmly on the ground, as if marking an invisible boundary. The animal's golden eyes shone in the light of the farm, and it observed the scene with a calm but vigilant posture. "What is that?" Helen asked, holding George's arm tightly. "A wolf," replied George, his voice still heavy from the tension of the night. He stayed with her. He protected her. Helen looked at the animal with a mixture of fear and fascination. It was impossible to deny that there was something different about him, something that could not be explained simply as a wild instinct. As if knowing his mission was complete, the wolf took a step back, still looking at the gathered family. Then he raised his head and let out a long, deep howl that reverberated throughout the farm. The sound echoed through the forest, passing through the trees and touching the hearts of everyone who heard it. It was like a goodbye, a farewell full of meaning. Emma, still wrapped in the warmth of Helen's embrace, whispered, "He doesn't want to leave us." Henry and Teresa sat in silence, watching as the wolf took a few more steps back until darkness completely enveloped him. He disappeared into the shadows of the trees, as if he had never been there, but the presence he left behind was undeniable. Inside the house, the fireplace was lit, and Emma was placed next to the fire, wrapped in warm blankets. Helen was preparing soup, while George finished reporting what had happened in the clearing. His voice shook as he described the moment he found Emma and how the wolf seemed more like a guardian than a threat. "It was something I never thought I'd see," he said, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "That animal. He wasn't normal." "It doesn't matter what he was," Helen replied, placing a bowl of hot soup in Emma's hands. "What matters is that he took care of our girl." Emma, still with a faint smile on her face, murmured, "He'll come back. I know he'll come back." George and Helen exchanged looks, not knowing how to respond. For them, the night already seemed like a mix of dream and reality. However, when morning finally arrived, and the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the farm, Henry decided to go out to check the forest. He walked to the edge of the trees, where the wolf had disappeared the night before. To his surprise, the footprints were still there. Large and well-defined, they headed towards the deep forest, but seemed to stop abruptly, as if the animal had simply disappeared. George bent down, touching the ground with his fingers. Those marks weren't just the tracks of a predator. They were like traces of something bigger, something he couldn't explain. He looked up at the trees, hoping perhaps to see the golden eyes once again. But all he found was the silence of the morning. When he returned to the house, Helen and Emma were waiting on the porch. "Is he still around?" Helen asked, holding Emma's hand tightly. Henry just nodded. "I think he is, but not like before. It's like he's watching us, making sure we're okay." Emma smiled slightly, with that sparkle in her eyes that no one could explain. She knew in her heart that this wolf, the guardian of the clearing, would never leave her completely. And as George looked at the forest one last time, he felt a strange tranquility. It didn't matter where that animal was now. What mattered was what he had done. He had been a protector, a symbol of strength in the midst of fear, a reminder that even on the darkest nights something or someone can emerge to guard us. And somehow, George knew that, if needed, the wolf would return, silent as the forest, but with the same determination as always. The next morning brought a different light to the farm, as if the sun wanted to dispel the horrors of the previous night. George and Helen were in the kitchen, exchanging silent glances while Emma rested on the living room sofa. She still looked fragile, but there was something new in her face, something that hadn't been there before. "We have to do something," Helen said, breaking the silence as she stirred a bowl of porridge. "Margaret can't get away with this." Henry nodded. "I'm going to the city. I'll tell the authorities everything. What she did was cruel, unacceptable." Shortly after he left, determined to seek justice for Emma. The story of a girl abandoned in the woods by her own stepmother quickly spread throughout the small community. The delegate listened to George's report carefully, taking detailed notes and promising to act immediately. "This is more than negligence," he said, his expression stern. "It's abandonment, and she will answer for it." Back at the farm, while George was away, Helen watched Emma carefully. The granddaughter, despite everything she had been through, seemed calm. Her eyes shone in a way that Helen couldn't explain, a mix of serenity and determination that seemed beyond her years. "How are you, darling?" Helen asked, sitting down next to her. Emma looked at her grandmother, a shy smile on her lips. "I'm fine, Grandma. Better than I thought I would be. I think he helped me." "Him?" Helen asked, confused. "The wolf," replied Emma as if it were obvious. "He stayed with me. I don't know how, but I knew he wouldn't leave me." Helen swallowed, feeling a shiver run through her body. There was something in Emma's voice, a conviction that made her question everything she knew about the world. "Maybe he was sent to look after you," she said softly, not knowing exactly what her own words meant. George returned to the farm at dusk, bringing with him the news that Margaret was already being sought by the authorities. "They said they'll take care of it," he said, placing his hat on the table. "She will answer for what she did." "That's a relief," Helen replied, while Emma watched everything in silence. But even with the guarantee of justice, the family felt that something had changed forever. The experience in the forest had marked Emma in a way that was not just traumatic. On the contrary, it seemed to have awakened something in her. The following days showed this more clearly. Emma began to demonstrate an inner strength that no one had noticed before. She, who used to be shy and insecure, now spoke with a calm that seemed rooted in something deep. "You look different, little one," George said one afternoon, as he pushed her in the wheelchair around the yard. Emma smiled. "I think I'm different, Grandpa. I can't explain it, but after that night, it's like I understood something important. That even when it feels like we're alone, maybe we really aren't." George looked at his granddaughter, impressed by her words. He didn't know if it was the trauma or if there really was something special about her experience, but one thing was certain. Emma had changed. Meanwhile, Helen felt that the wolf's presence still hovered over the farm. It was irrational, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was nearby, watching from afar. Sometimes at dawn, George would find footprints at the edge of the forest, as if the animal had passed through there during the night. "He's still protecting us, Helen," he said one morning, showing the marks on the floor. "I believe that," Helen replied, holding George's hand. "Somehow he's part of us now." The farm returned to its routine, but it was never the same. The story of Emma and the wolf became a kind of local legend, something that neighbors whispered among themselves with admiration and mystery. And for Emma, the wolf wasn't just a memory. He was a symbol of something greater. Whenever she looked at the forest, she felt a tranquility she couldn't explain. He knew that wherever he was, the wolf remained his guardian. It wasn't just an animal. It was a strength that had arisen to protect her in her darkest hour, and she would carry that connection for the rest of her life. Justice had been done, and Emma's renewal was visible to everyone. But the biggest lesson she, George, and Helen learned was that even in the scariest and loneliest moments, there is something, or someone, that appears to remind us that we are never completely helpless. And for Emma, that something would always be the forest wolf. And so ends this incredible story, full of mystery, strength, and transformation. But now we want to hear from you. What did you think of the connection between Emma and the wolf? Do you believe that greater forces can act in moments of despair? Leave your comment below. We really want to know your opinion. Oh, and if you liked this story and want to follow others like it, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps us continue to bring you exciting content, and activate the bell so you don't miss any news. Thanks for watching and see you next time.